Now, in this church right now, we use what's called the narrative lectionary. I understand that Julie King did it during her ministry too. You might not remember it. She told me that. I didn't know she did. Narrative lectionary takes the Bible, scope of the story of the Bible, and divides it up into 4 years. So you get a sense of the storyline of the Bible each Sunday that we come. And we go through the Old Testament in the fall, and then at Advent we have the birth of Jesus, and we follow Jesus in the Gospels through the spring, and then we get a letter. And so this Sunday we begin with one of the letters, and it's the first letter of Paul. Galatians is the earliest writing that we have in the New Testament. The Bible doesn't order the books by when they were written. They order the books by different reasons. I think they did the Gospels in reverse alphabetical order. They order the letters by the length. So Romans is the first letter because it's by far the longest. Even though it's the last letter Paul wrote, it's the first letter in the letters. And Galatians is somewhere in the middle because it's kind of a middle length. Paul probably wrote this somewhere between 45 and 53 AD. Kind of like a friend of mine. I said, "How old are you?" And she said, "Oh, I'm somewhere between 45 and 53. But that's what Paul wrote. We don't know the exact time, but it's about 15 years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. It's not real long, somewhere between 15 and 20 years after Jesus lived. That's like back to 9/11 for us. So even shorter than that. So that's when Paul wrote this. And he wrote it to a group in Galatia. And the front of your bulletins shows this green on your map. That green to the right of Asia, pink Asia, is Galatia. It's a whole area. It's not one church. It's the churches of Galatia. And so they would have taken this letter and carried it around to different churches and read it to the different churches from Paul. And then later people copied it, and then the earliest copy we have is from about 300 AD, so it's been copied over and over for 300 years before we have the copy that we have. And so when you think about this, this is the earliest writing in the New Testament. And the other thing is, whenever we read a letter of Paul, we're reading somebody else's mail. We're reading somebody else's mail, and some people love reading somebody else's mail, but we don't have to steam the envelope open. We can just read it. But it also means that we only get one side of the conversation. We have to figure out, why is Paul writing this to this church? Why is he saying this? Because all we get is one side of the conversation. Now, sometimes having one side of the conversation helps us. I mean, if you're listening to your friend on the phone, "Oh, that's great. Good news. How is she feeling? Well, what's his name? Calvin. Oh, that's a good Reformed name. How much does he weigh? Is he healthy?" You can tell a lot, right? By that one-sided conversation. Somebody's just had a baby named Calvin. So we can figure out a lot, but we don't know everything, and so we're trying to do that. The other thing, just to tell you about letters, is we write letters as "Dear so-and-so" and sign it at the end, right? And so often you have to turn the letter over to figure out who wrote it, because sometimes you want to know who it's from before you read it. Now, Diane, when she taught business letters always have your name and address at the top right. And so you got your name first, and then you knew who it was from before you started the letter. And that's what they did. They start with who wrote the letter first. They don't sign it at the end. They sign it at the beginning, so you know who it's from, and then they say who it's to. So this is how Paul starts his letter. It's Galatians 1, if you're reading along. And I'm going to begin with the first verse, even though the narrative lectionary today begins later. Paul, an apostle. Now, an apostle is sent, one who is sent by God. Disciples follow Jesus, apostles are sent. And apostles were particular people. All the disciples were sent as apostles, but apostles had to be voted on by the church if they're to be sent. But he's an apostle sent neither by human commission nor from human authorities, but through Jesus Christ and God. So he's saying, I'm sent not by a vote at Antioch or Jerusalem. I'm sent straight from God. I had an experience. We read about it in Acts, the road to Damascus. I had an experience of Jesus and God that I do. Now, my calling comes from the church. I have a personal calling from God, and then I had to be approved by a congregation to call me, and I had to have a vote for our group of churches called a presbytery. So I couldn't just have a personal calling from God, and part of the approval meant I had to go to seminary for 4 years, and I had to study and learn different things before I could be approved. And then a group of people voted that they too think I'm called by God to the ministry. That's how we do things, and that's how they began to do things early in the church. They voted on who's sent to be an apostle. But Paul says, I'm not sent. My authority doesn't come just from humans. It comes straight from God. I had an experience of Jesus. And I wondered if somebody came up to me today and said, your seminary degree doesn't mean anything, your calling by the presbytery doesn't mean anything, because I had a direct vision of Jesus, and I heard Jesus' voice, and that does better than your call. How would I react to that? Would I lock him up, or would I listen? And so that's kind of what's going on. Paul is saying, listen to me, because my authority doesn't come from human beings. It comes straight from God. And then he says, from Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead, and all the brothers and sisters with me. So this isn't just for me, it's from the people that are with me. And then he says to. Remember, you say who it's from, then to the churches of Galatia. And then every time Paul writes a letter, it's grace and peace to you. The grace of God's love and the peace that comes, the eirene or the shalom, the wholeness. Peace doesn't mean just an absence of war. Peace is wholeness. Grace and peace to you from God the Father and Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins to set us free from this evil age that we live in, according to the will of God our Father, to whom be glory forever and ever. And so that's how Paul opens his letter. Listen to me, because I've been sent from God. I have a story about that, of something that happened more recently. One of my favorite authors is Tony Campolo. Tony Campolo, I think he died about 10 years ago. He's 84, but he was a Christian sociologist and a teacher at a college, but one of the best speakers that I ever heard. And one of his greatest stories he collected into a book called Let Me Tell You a Story. And this story comes from that book. And so I'm going to read it to you. Several years ago, I was invited to speak at a small Pentecostal college located near Eastern College, where I teach. I love going to that little school because the people there seem to be so in touch with the power of the Holy Spirit. Before the chapel service, several of the faculty members took me into a side room to pray with me. I got down on my knees, and 6 of them put their hands on my head and prayed for me, asking the Holy Spirit to fill me up and use me effectively as I spoke to the students. Pentecostals seem to pray a lot longer and with more dynamism than we Baptists do. They're like the Energizer Bunny. They just go on and on. These men prayed long, and the longer they prayed, the more they leaned on my head. They prayed on and leaned harder and harder, and one of them kept whispering, "Do you feel the Spirit? Do you feel the Spirit?" And I thought, I feel something at the base of my neck, but I'm not sure it was the Spirit. One of the faculty members prayed at length, not for me, but about a particular man named Charlie Stoltzfus. That kind of ticked me off. I thought to myself, if you're going to lean on my head, the least you can do is pray for me. But he prayed on and on for this guy who was about to abandon his wife and 3 children. And I could still hear him calling out, Lord, Lord, don't let that man leave his wife. Send an angel to bring that man back to his family. Don't let that family be destroyed. You know who I'm talking about, Lord. You know who I'm talking about. Charlie Stoltzfus. He lives down the road about a mile on the right-hand side in a silver house trailer. And I thought to myself with some degree of exasperation, God knows where he lives. God's not sitting up there in heaven going, could you give that address to me one more time? I almost got it. Following the chapel talk, I got in my car and headed home. And I was getting onto the Pennsylvania Turnpike when I saw a young man hitchhiking on the side of the road. I picked him up. I know you're not supposed to, but I'm a Baptist preacher, and whenever I can get someone locked in to where I can preach to them, I do it. And we pulled back onto the highway, and I introduced myself. I said, my name's Tony Campola. What's your name? And he said, my name's Charlie Stoltzfus. I didn't say a word. I drove down the turnpike, got off at the next exit, turned around, and headed back. And when I did that, he looked at me and said, hey, mister, where are you taking me? I said, I'm taking you home. He said, why? I said, because you just left your wife, right? And 3 children, right? The man said, right. And he leaned against the passenger door the rest of the way, staring at me. I drove off the turnpike and onto a side road, straight up to a silver house trailer. And when I pulled into the drive, he looked at me with astonishment and said, how did you know I lived here? And I said, God told me. God sent me. And I believe that God did tell me. I think God may set up things like that just for fun. I mean, if you're God, you're probably having a pretty sad time of it, looking down on all the things that are wrong in the world. I can just imagine God nudging Peter and saying, hey, Pete, watch this. I told Charlie, you get in that house trailer because I want to talk to you and I want to talk to your wife. And he ran into the mobile home ahead of me. I don't know what he said to his wife, but when I got in the house trailer, her eyes were as wide as his. And I sat down and said, I'm going to talk and you're going to listen. And they listened. And during the next hour, I led both of them to Jesus. And today, that guy is a Pentecostal preacher down south. When the Spirit leads, there are all kinds of surprises in store for us. So Charlie Stoltzfus was wondering, who are you? He said, God sent me. That's how I know. And that's what Paul's saying with this letter. Why should we listen to you? Because God sent me and God told me. And this is where we're reading somebody else's mail. I am astonished, Paul says in verse 6, that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Now, Paul had established those churches, but apparently, that's what we have to read into the letter, somebody else has come along and told him, Paul wasn't quite right about this. This is really the gospel, the good news. He says, I'm amazed how easily you all are turning to a different gospel because of these people that have come. Not that there is a different gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be accursed. If anybody proclaims a different gospel, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I repeat, if anyone proclaims to you a gospel contrary to what you received, let that one be accursed. Am I now seeking human approval or God's approval? Am I trying to please people? If I were still pleasing people, I would not be a servant of Christ. You know, there are times that we hear different gospels. If you turn on the TV, you hear a very different gospel than you hear today. If you go across the street or go down the road, you'll hear a different gospel than here. We hear different gospels, different understandings of what it means. We have so much in common, but we have some differences here and there. And Paul's saying these differences are so huge that it's a whole different gospel. It's not just a slight twist like we might have from here down the road. It's a huge change. And he says, you're perverting that. And then he says, you've heard no doubt of my earlier life in Judaism. It's the only time the word Judaism is used in the whole New Testament. You've heard of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God. I was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous than the traditions of my ancestors. So at first, Paul is persecuting the church. At first, Paul, remember, the church isn't separate. It's just a sect of Judaism. And at first, Paul is saying those who are following Jesus Christ are perverting Judaism. And so he's persecuting the church. But when the one who had set me apart before I was born, when God who set me apart before I was born called me through his grace and was pleased to reveal his son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went away at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. So remember, Paul is called by a vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus. Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? When you're persecuting the church, you're persecuting me. Why are you against me? And he realizes that he's going against God when he's going against the followers of Jesus. And he becomes a zealous follower of Jesus instead of a zealous Pharisee. And then he says in chapter 2, verse 11, but when Cephas, now Cephas is an Aramaic term for rock, just like Petra is the Greek term for rock. It's the nickname of Peter, because Jesus said to Simon, his name was Simon, Jesus says to Simon, you are Petra, and on this rock I'll build the church. You are rocky, and on this rock I'll build this church. Well, Cephas is just Aramaic language for the same name. So it's talking about Simon Peter. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. You talk about conflict in the church. You know, some places in the New Testament it says everybody got along great. No, they didn't. Paul is so upset with Simon Peter Cephas that he opposes him to his face in public because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, and this is before what we read last week in Acts, where they voted that they could go to the Gentiles, and they didn't have to follow Jewish customs. Until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. So Peter had also gone to the non-Jews, the Gentiles, who didn't follow kosher. He ate with them, even though they weren't following the law of Moses by what they ate. He was eating them, but then eating with them. But then James, followers of James come, and Peter pulls back. After they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So Peter was eating with the Gentiles, saying, you know, those kosher laws don't apply to followers of Jesus. But when people from James comes, he pulls back from eating with them. And because he wants to please the people that are coming. And Paul earlier said, am I to please people? Am I on the side of human beings or of God? That's been a phrase that stuck with me throughout my ministry, because there are times that I wonder, I'm a people pleaser. That's my personality. I love to be liked. And so I sometimes wonder, am I doing this just to be liked? Or am I doing this because I'm following Jesus? And sometimes following Jesus means not being liked. And so Paul is saying, I'm not doing it just to be popular. But he's pointing to Peter and saying, Peter, first of all, didn't think anything was wrong with eating with Gentiles until people came from the circumcision faction, and then he pulled back. In the 80s in Moberly, I worked hard to get women into Kiwanis. We had just voted. Kiwanis used to be a men's business club. And when so many women were in business, many of us wanted women to be members of Kiwanis. And so we worked for 5 years to get women into Kiwanis in Moberly. And it's a wonderful place, and a wonderful place for men and women to be together. And that when I moved to Moberly 2 years later, after that, I was invited to Rotary, where they had just approved one woman Rotarian in Moberly, 1991, so 34 years ago. They just approved one woman, and many of the men didn't want any women. They said, we need a place just for men. And younger men said, well, there are women that are in business, and we need a place for business. This is a business club. You represent your own business in Rotary. I don't know if you went through that here, but they went through that there. And when I came to the meeting, there were 3 sets of tables. And over here was the one woman with 5 younger men. And the third table over was all the old guard that didn't want a woman Rotarian. And in the middle was the sons of the old guard that weren't sure where they stood. Sometimes we fight over who we eat with even today. And so that's what Peter was doing, was pulling back from that. And Paul is saying you're missing the whole gospel. The gospel is the faith of Jesus. The gospel is that Christ has died for us and we die with Christ. And there isn't something you have to do to make yourself right with God. What we do when we're made right with God, everything we do is to live that out. And so he says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I, but Christ that lives in me. And the life I live is the life of the faith of Christ. Galatians is a difficult letter. We're going to read some more of it, but not as lengthy a part. But it's a time to understand the freedom that we find in Jesus Christ. Not that there are rules or regulations we have to fight over, but that we have freedom to love one another and to live out our faith. It helps to understand the law and the rules, but we don't have to abide by all of them. Nancy learned piano here, growing up, and she played other people's music. And she went to Stevens College, where she played other people's music and learned all the rules about piano, and was a good piano player, and put on recitals here in this church and at Stevens. But an interesting thing happened about 15 years ago. She stopped playing other people's music. And she just let the music flow out of her, and she actually started composing music as it flowed out of her. I think that's part of what it means to be crucified with Christ and risen to a new life. The law of the Old Testament and the rules that we have give a structure that Nancy had at the beginning of her playing the piano. She didn't start from nothing. She learned all that. But then all of a sudden, there's a freedom where our lives just flow and where our music comes out of us. And that is what Paul is writing to the Galatians. That if you only hold on to the rules and regulations and stay so caught in that, you never live the life that Christ offers